And now we have the Fyffe family, Jill, Stan, Rory and Lucy.
Yes, sir.
Please state your full name.
My full name is Gillian Fyffe.
Please hold the book in your raised hand, doesn't matter which one, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Stanley Fyffe.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and duly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name.
Rory Fyffe.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Lucy Parham.
and take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Jill, you're here with Stan, together with your children Rory and Lucy, to talk about the circumstances of your infection with hepatitis C, the treatment you received, the consequences of that treatment and the effect it's had on all of you and on your family lives.
Yes.
Jill and Stan, you met at school, and Stan, you subsequently qualified as a chartered engineer. Jill, you studied English and psychology and then went on to do postgraduate studies. You worked as a librarian and as a teacher, and you had aspirations for a career in academia.
Yes.
You married in 1980, and what years were Rory and Lucy born?
1980. Rory was born in 1985 and Lucy in 1988.
Now, in 1988, when you were pregnant with Lucy, in the very, very late stages of pregnancy, you were admitted to Ninewells Hospital, Dundee, where Lucy was born with a forceps delivery.
Yes, that's right. I had been admitted previously because she was lying the wrong way, and then I went home again, and I was told that if I didn't go into labour, I would be induced. And in the 41st week of my pregnancy, we went into hospital and for that induction to take place.
And following the birth, you had to undergo a procedure that you, Stan, have described as a brutal one, which was to have the placenta manually extracted.
Yes.
And you bled a lot as a result of that procedure.
Yes, I certainly bled. I always find it difficult to quantify how much. I did bleed, but there were no emergency buttons being pressed, or it was... The nursing staff reacted in a routine manner, but because the placenta was removed manually, that's obviously not something that can be achieved without some bleeding.
And that was the point at which one of the doctors broached with you the subject of a blood transfusion. What can you recall about that first conversation?
I think Lucy was born, I think, around about 3 o'clock in the morning. I think it was later that afternoon or possibly the next day. I know that Stan had left the hospital, so I think it may have been late afternoon that same day. It was a Friday. I remember the doctor who had been in attendance when she was born, but there had been a rush. 3 babies were born at once. The hospital appeared to us understaffed. And so one doctor had delivered all 3 babies. And he came that afternoon and said that we're going to check your bloods, but we think we will transfuse you. And then subsequently he came back and he said, yes, we're going to give you a blood transfusion. And because it was 1988 and we'd had the AIDS campaign and there were posters everywhere, and because I was teaching and we had been given a lot of advice, the teaching staff had been given a lot of advice about how to care for children if they bled, which normally we hadn't needed that advice. If a child injured themselves, you just rush to help. But now we were told to put gloves on first, which seemed very odd to us. So because of that advice, the idea of being transfused with a stranger's blood, I recoiled from that and said, well, can I talk to my husband first? And 2 things happened. I tried to explain to the doctor that I'm not averse. I know everything in life is a risk. I'm not averse to taking a risk. But I wanted to find out how much I needed the transfusion, because at the beginning, the doctor was talking about I would need 2 months bed rest. He said you will have to rest for up to 2 months and possibly get some help at home. And I thought, well, I can manage. We're in the fortunate position that we can cope with that. So I said, well, I think I'd probably rather have the bed rest. And he said, no, we really want to transfuse. We had a sort of discussion, we didn't agree, and then I said I'd like to phone my husband. The sister, I remember, whose name I don't recall, but the sister was quite annoyed with me by this point because it was sort of her job to make the patients behave, I think. And she said, you really ought to do what the doctor tells you. And I said, well, I'd just like to talk to my husband first. And there were no mobile phones in those days, and the phone was on, there was a payphone on the wall. But I knew there was one on a trolley as well. And she said, I said, can you get me the phone? And she said, well, if you can walk to that payphone, you can call your husband. It was at the other side of the ward. So I walked to the payphone. But I was annoyed. That was why I got to the payphone. And called my husband and said, please get to the hospital because they want to transfuse me and I'm not happy about why. So Stan came to the hospital. Is this still answering your question?
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So Stan came to the hospital and I told him what was happening. Because he is an engineer and because I did science at school, we were of the opinion that nothing is 100% safe. So every time we asked, how much do I need this transfusion, the doctor would say, the blood is totally safe. And we were even more alarmed because we thought, well, number one, that's probably not true. And number two, it's not the question we're asking you. So this went on and on and on. And he was saying, otherwise I would need bed rest, which didn't seem sufficient reason to us. Eventually, it became, to shorten this story, it's a very uncomfortable thing to do, to disagree with a doctor. The nurses started talking about it. One of the nurses said to me, the whole hospital's talking about you. And I went, oh, God. And I said, well, what would you do? Would you take the blood transfusion? And she said I wouldn't touch it with a tarry barge pole, which didn't exactly shorten the conversation. And although we had never, I can't remember the point at which this happened, but although we had never, I was worried about AIDS, because I'd heard of AIDS, I'd never heard of hepatitis. And but we do remember an older nurse saying, it's not just HIV you've got to worry about, there's hepatitis and God knows what. But that comment just went over my head because I was just worried about HIV. And eventually, the doctor said that another consultant was coming to talk to me, and it's my recollection that was a consultant from the blood transfusion service. But certainly another man of consultant age arrived at my bed. I don't think Stan was there at that point because obviously we had Rory to care for and you had just taken over running an engineering office in town, and so he didn't know how much of an emergency it was at the hospital and he was responsible for this office. And so I think you weren't there at this point, and another consultant arrived at the bed and told me the blood was totally safe. And I said, but that's not my question. My question is, how much do I need it? Stan came back to the hospital, and by this time I was getting really tired, but I think because I just had a baby and because I felt I was holding out against the whole hospital, there were some sympathetic nurses. And anyway, when Stan came back to the hospital, the doctor who had delivered Lucy said to him, you see, if we don't transfuse her tonight and she hemorrhages again, we won't be able to get the blood in fast enough. So Stan immediately came to me. I mean, they were standing just about 6 feet from the bed, and he came over and said, Jill, you have to take it because you might die if you don't take it. So I said, okay, I'll take it. We were very scared, I remember, because I can't remember really pressing the doctor, why have you suddenly changed your mind? I think we just kind of had the feeling that, oh, we've pushed it too far, and now it is an emergency. So we went, okay, we'll take it. And the doctor said, well, the nurse will come to prepare you, and it will take several hours and all the rest of it. And I remember saying to Stan, well, just go home and see to Rory, because Rory was with my mother, and I knew that, you know, he normally would. I wanted him to see Stan before he went to bed, because Mummy wasn't there. So I was saying, go and see Rory. It's almost done now. We know what we're doing. So Stan came back to the hospital the next morning.
Just sitting there.
Yes.
And before we get to the overnight position, Stan, is there anything you recollect different from or additional to what Jill's described in terms of this conversation that was taking place with the doctors?
Well, yes. Additionally to that, one of the things that was a driving force for I came back into the hospital and saw Jill very white on the bed. And, of course, knowing nothing about how white people look with anemia, you know, that alarmed me. But I'm very, very much of the opinion that the doctors were given a specific mandate, and they were told, you're only being allowed to transfuse Jill on the basis that this is an emergency, and that specifically you're being told to give her the blood now, such that it's safe overnight. You know, it's not just you're getting blood to make you safe. It's because you've told us it's an emergency. I mean, we're specific. You've told us it's an emergency, and you've told us that you need to get the blood in right now. And oh yes, that's what was going to happen.
Sorry, can I just say, you mean a mandate from you?
A mandate from us, yes.
Yes.
You know, we're telling you as a doctor, this is what we will accept.
And that's the point at which the way you've put it in your statement, Stan, is the doctors changed tack almost, and it was now being described to you as something that was needed as a matter of emergency.
Sorry, that's slightly out of order because Jill was resisting it, and we were then both saying we're not prepared to take blood unless it's an emergency. At that stage, they changed tack and said, "Oh yes, if Jill in fact, the phrase was, if Jill hemorrhages overnight, we won't be able to get the blood into her fast enough." Now, and that was when I persuaded Jill to take the blood. I now subsequently think we should have, in hindsight, pressed the doctors a lot harder on that. I still haven't gone into how fast you can get blood into people and all that sort of thing. But we took that for granted, and that was the instructions they were given. Yes, it's an emergency, you can put blood in tonight.
And you went off to see Rory.
Yes.
And your shared expectation was, in light of what you'd been told, that the transfusion would begin pretty much straight away.
Right away.
What in
Yes.
fact happened, Jill?
What happened was that I waited, and the nurses, I think I fed Lucy, and then I fell asleep. And I remember waiting for the 2 o'clock feed, or being woken for it, and saying, "Oh, what's happening?" And the nurse saying, "Oh, they're just going to wait till morning now." Because I think she said because we're short-staffed. And so I fed Lucy and fell asleep again. I was, because I'd been up all the night before. I feel I should say, I think I've missed something out at this point, which is that when just before the manual extraction, I said that the labour suite seemed to be understaffed and the doctor was running round and round. And just after Lucy was born, he arrived in our room and said, and shouted at the midwife, who was a young, lovely young girl, but young, and he shouted at her and she burst into tears, which rather shocked us. And then he came to the bed and said, what's happened is an injection has to be given at the right time so that you your body will, you'll have another contraction to release the placenta, and it's been given at the wrong time and I can't repeat it. So I'm going to have to do a manual extraction. So to go back to sorry about that, to go back to where we were, what happened overnight was I fed Lucy and was told that the transfusion wouldn't take place until the next morning, and I didn't quite know what that meant in a hospital because they seemed to, it's anything from 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock. So, the next morning, everything started in the ward as usual. They brought breakfast for everybody, including me. I fed Lucy again, and then they said, right, let's get this transfusion started. I'm ashamed to say now that by then I was just mortified that the whole, everybody was talking about the fact that she's held out for, I can't remember how long it was now, but 36 hours or more than that, and now she's having it, and I think I just didn't have any fight left in me. So the transfusion started, and Stan arrived half an hour later and said, oh, you nearly finished? And I went, no, we've just started. I know that I had actually, because I remember watching the blood come down the tube and reach my arm, and I remember saying, please don't let me get HIV, but I didn't know to say, please don't let me get hepatitis. And then Stan came in and I said, we just started, and he said, he was absolutely livid. He was furious, because by then I was just like flattened, but Stan said, this was not what they told us. How can it have been an emergency if you were up half the night feeding your baby? So we began to, we thought, and more have thought since then, that the blood was given for some other reason. And Stan will tell you what he thinks about that.
Yeah, I was very clear that the blood was to be administered that night, and then if that didn't happen, they had no mandate to administer it later. So when I came in the morning, I think Jill said the blood basically just started going into my arm, because I think saline solution goes in first. And I said that's not what was meant to happen. I was furious because we had, we asked to take blood only as an emergency, and it wasn't being done as an emergency. So it made everything he said before a lie, as far as I was concerned. Added to the fact that the nurse, in fact, I think the nurses changed the thing when I was there. The nurses were all covered in gloves and things, and I thought, well, you've told us it's safe. You've told us it's an emergency. You put it in late, and then you're all wearing gloves. We were really upset by then.
I remember you asked why you were wearing gloves, and the nurse said, well, that's our standard practice. But we just felt really frustrated that nobody had understood that we were not risk averse. You hear about people who refuse to take blood for other reasons, and it seems a bit strange. But we weren't. If they had said, yeah, the blood's 90%, we've got this problem at the moment, so the blood, there is a bit of a chance that the blood's not all right. However, here are your chances without it. We would just have weighed that up and had a lot more faith in the doctors. But it was because they kept saying it's 100% safe that we kept thinking, no, it isn't. And however, at that point, we decided, and I think I was instrumental in this, not to say, I mean, Stan was raging, but I was saying, I've got it now.
There was no point in remonstrating. That was our decision.
Yes,
no point.
And I couldn't. You're in that position in hospital where you're totally dependent on the doctors. You don't really understand. We don't have a medical training, so you don't really understand what's going on. And it's really quite a scary thing to annoy them. I felt we'd annoyed them enough.
You had the transfusion. You left the hospital to go home as soon as you could. Mm-hmm. We'll just have a look at one document. Jill, it's going to come up on our screens, but you've got it in hard copy there.
Thank you.
And Paul, it's 03630002. Jill, if you go just past your witness statement, your exhibit start, and it's written in black ink in the top right-hand corner, there'll be some page numbers, and it should be page 1.
Yes, thank you.
So it's a letter from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and it refers to the circumstances of the labour and Lucy's birth. And if we look at the second paragraph, it says, initially unwilling to accept blood transfusion, but she was finally given one. I understand you have an observation to make about that comment.
Yes, well, I think it's the understatement of the year. I have sort of shortened the story so that we're not here all day, but it went on and on and on. And, you know, they were bringing consultants to my bed. The nurse said the whole staff canteen was engaged in a debate about it. It was utterly humiliating. The sister was furious. So I think initially unwilling doesn't describe what happened. I found six things in this letter which I think are varying degrees of inaccurate. One of them is that labour was spontaneous. It wasn't. It was induced. I found 6. I don't know whether I'll find them all now. And another one was that I was initially unwilling, which is an understatement. Finally given one, I think my husband would argue with. He thinks I was coerced into taking one. And there were another 2, but I'm probably too nervous to find them now.
You weren't just found to be anemic. You were.
Oh yes, that was the. Yes, I wasn't just found to be anemic. We'd had a whole. They knew why I was anemic. They'd ripped out the placenta. So, but there's no mention here of a manual extraction. There's no mention that it was induced. There's no mention that the injection was given late. So I think it's a wholly inaccurate account of what happened.
And Stan, you pulled no punches in your witness statement. You've described yourselves as feeling that you were both tricked and conned and forced into having the transfusion.
Absolutely, that's what I think. I think we were. I think the doctors wanted the transfusion because the transfusion was the best way of getting Jill right back to health, getting Jill out of the system, reduced their immediate risk of repercussions for what had gone clearly wrong, and so basically to get them out of trouble and for their convenience, they wanted Jill transfused. There was no doubt when they first started speaking that when we asked them, bed rest was all that was necessary. But they then changed their minds and decided that they wanted to transfuse. So basically they tricked, conned, duped, whatever.
They changed.
And in retrospect, we should have pressed them harder. But also seeing the other people this morning, I think everyone feels that in retrospect they should have done something differently. So it's very difficult for the patient, so to speak, to be just as clear as they would like to be. So I think we were very much coerced.
I think we feel that we set the bar for transfusion, and when they couldn't argue us into changing that bar, they just met it and said, "Okay, it's emergency now." Is what we feel happened.
Yes.
Jill, I want to ask you next about the years that followed the transfusion, 1988 through to 1995. How were you physically over those years?
Well, I'm not quite sure where to start. We were very ambitious in the small sense. We had a lot of plans, and we'd worked hard at school and college, and we had career plans, both of us. We wanted to build our own house. We did build our own house, but very quickly that building their own house became a way of facilitating Stan's self-employment, because it was obvious that I wasn't coping. And, well, it was obvious to us. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, because I was utterly ashamed of it and would go to any lengths not to let people know how much I wasn't coping. I was exhausted the way I've heard other witnesses describe today, and it's really difficult to describe. I used to say it's, sometimes if you are very tired just before you go to bed, I've heard people say, oh, I must get to bed, I'm exhausted, but I haven't got the energy to clean my teeth. So you sit for another half an hour because trying to summon up the energy just to climb into bed. But I used to say I feel like that when I open my eyes in the morning, and every single thing I do all day, it's all done just as an effort of will. And my head is just screaming, sit down, because I'm so tired. I used to, I was also always cold. So I would pull my chair up against the radiator if Stan wasn't looking, and just to get warm. And the reason it was if Stan wasn't looking was that immediately the heat of the radiator put me to sleep. And we have discovered that if you fall asleep in the radiator, your own body weight presses you against it. And within about 20 minutes, when your husband arrives to haul you off it, a huge blister will appear. And I'm happy to show you if you want me to, but I've got scars all down my arms because I did it again and again and again. And I was absolutely ashamed about that as well. And I think it's, I want to talk about this later, but there was, the doctors had been, we put the transfusion behind us, and obviously this was 7 years, and the doctors had been adamant that we were wrong and they were right and the blood was totally safe. And we felt we did what we could in the situation, and then we just got on with all our plans. So when I wasn't coping and I would say to people, oh, I'm just really tired, of course everybody says, oh, I'm really tired too. So that conversation goes nowhere. And or else they say, well, you've got 2 young children. But I would look at my friends and they had 2 young children and they were going back to work, and I just felt, I'd been brought up to try hard, and I couldn't understand why it wasn't working.
Sorry, just to add to it, this tiredness against the radiator was such that Jill was very resistant. By the time she was so tired, she was very resistant to be taken off the radiator.
Or being woken up,
Or being woken up, and she was,
Get off, just leave me alone.
Violently is the word for it.
Yeah.
It got to the stage, the only way that I could sort of deal with the situation was to curl around and put my arm on the radiator, and I ended up burning myself trying to keep Jill off the radiator. So she was really exhausted.
Utterly exhausted,
and we resolved it in our own mind, because other than that it was asymptomatic. She was just exhausted. We decided that Jill was getting old before her time. That was what we resolved in our minds for years. We thought that.
And of course I was ashamed about that as well. And then on one occasion in that period, so I did go back to work, and we decided, we built a house, but we decided this has been it's the house. It's been too much for us, too big an undertaking, too soon. And I was going back to work, and I had to give up again, and then I must have tried that about 3 times. And eventually we thought, I'd been happy as a student in St Andrews, and we thought, let's just go to St Andrews, a quiet little town, and we'll just rent, and then we'll build another house, but we just obviously need a couple of years to recoup. So we sold the house, sold very quickly.
So we bought another one, a smaller one.
Oh, sorry, we bought another one, yeah. We bought a little flat in St Andrews, and I looked for teaching work again. Just about the period, just when we were moving to St Andrews, it was Christmas, and I'd ordered Rory's Christmas present in the toy shop at St Andrews, and they phoned and said the present had arrived. So it was a drive of about 15 miles, so I said to Stan, I'm just going to take the children and go and collect his present. And there was all sorts of laughter about how I was going to get it in the boot without Rory seeing. And off we went, and on the way, so it was December, it was dark about 4 o'clock, and on the way to St Andrews, I fell asleep at the wheel. And not for very long, because when I woke up, there was a line of cars, and we were all travelling, obviously, at the same speed. And when I woke up, I was on the other side of the road, but still opposite the gap where I obviously slid across the road. And I remember thinking, I knew instantly I'm going to fall asleep at the wheel, although I'd never heard of that before, but I knew that's what had happened. And in the very far distance, I could see headlights coming towards me, but they were literally, I mean, they must have been half a mile away. It was the coast road, St Andrews, and I just remember thinking, if I hit that car, I'll kill the driver. And I knew there was a golf course, and I stupidly thought, I'll just go to drive onto the golf course and get myself out of this situation. So I just turned the wheel and attempted stupidly to drive onto the golf course. I didn't know that there was a drop of about
15 feet.
15 feet. There was a sort of culvert between the road and the golf course. And Rory remembers being airborne.
Yes, I remember. I remember the car being airborne, and obviously the sort of impact. And Mum was her thought after it happened was that the car might catch fire or might explode.
That was November 1991, I think.
I'll check dates with my family, because one of the things about my treatment is that I'm rubbish at dates.
That's the date you put in your statement.
It's the date I put in my statement. Yeah, we will have checked all that together. Yes, yeah.
And in this period, in the 7 years from 1988 to 1995, and we'll come on to the significance of 1995 in a minute, you didn't go to the GP or to seek help. And
No.
what was the reason for that?
I was ashamed. I thought I wasn't coping. I was young. I was early 30s, and I'd expected to do so well. Well, in my, you know, I just wanted to. I enjoyed teaching, and I was teaching in that period latterly in schools in Fyffe, all sorts of different schools, and. Before Rory was born, I taught full-time, and the financial plan was to start doing that again. So until a post became available, I did cover, and I did, one of the jobs was a one-year contract, but in the end I had to leave that, because what was happening was I would get home from school at 4 o'clock and say, I'm just going to sit down for 5 minutes, and I just slept. I would sometimes sleep right through supper. I got upset because I missed the children, and just woke up really in time to go back to school. So that wasn't working very well. I also taught a little bit at St Andrews University. That was better, and that was where I really wanted to end up. But that was better because I took tutorials. Well, you can go in, you just go and take the tutorial and go and work at home. And I also taught in the evening programme for when the government brought in I can't remember what it was called, but it was adult education evening programmes based in university departments, so I taught on that. And that was easier for me to do. Sorry, I've forgotten your question now, but that's what I was doing until in that latterly in that 7-year period. But the last year of it, we were getting concerned because I wanted to hold down these jobs, and we needed to hold them down financially. And when I got home, I was asleep immediately.
And I wanted to ask Rory, because you've got quite a distinct memory of this period from when you were about 8 years old for the next 2-3 years before your mum's formal diagnosis, about things being not quite right, not normal, is the way you put it in your statement. What can you recall?
Yes, I remember my parents, the family, making perfectly sort of reasonable plans, schedules throughout the day, but then we never seemed to achieve them. Being late was a very common occurrence, and that became it wasn't bullying, but teasing amongst my friends and at school. The Fyffes are always late, and we could never really understand why. Something seemed wrong. The more effort we put in, the more tired we got, and the less we seemed to achieve, and something didn't add up.
And you remember your mum falling asleep on the landing by the radiator, and you and Lucy would sometimes curl up next to her and and fall asleep too.
Yes, absolutely.
And Lucy, you've got a distinct memory of one particular occasion when that happened, and your mum had been holding a cup of very hot coffee and fell asleep with it in her hand. What happened?
Yeah, it wasn't unusual for us all to curl up on the landing, just because, if Mum didn't have energy to brush her teeth, she certainly didn't have energy to put two young children to bed. So we would, and we were too young to put ourselves to bed, so we'd sort of be tired and sleepily cuddle in. And Dad got Mum a cup of coffee to try and give her the energy to get us to bed. And I'd fallen asleep. And then I woke to just a very strange feeling on my calf. And I was whisked up and put into the bath and showered down. And Mum had fallen asleep and tilted the boiling water onto me. I also remember I was given sweeties from the garage. And so we showered it down and things, but it left a huge burn down the back of my calf, the whole of my calf, that took weeks to heal. I'm not sure if we went to the doctor, but Mum would change the dressings every night, and it was just, well, I've put in my statement, at that age, to me it looked like the top of a lasagna. It was just an absolute mess. And I remember...
It's what we call a full thickness burn.
Yeah, I remember Mum cleaning the wound, me lying on my front in the bath and hearing the scissors clink and thinking, well, what were they for? And to put it nicely, they weren't just for the bandages. And then going into school and having this burn that soaked through my tights and through the bandages and into my tights, so we'd have to soak my tights off. So, yeah, and all of these occasions leading to just a lot of confusion that why has nobody else got this?
We used to say there's something going on that we don't understand. We actually used to say that.
And then, November 1995, you received a letter.
Yes.
Paul, could we have up on screen, please, 0363003? It should be the third page.
Thank you.
Jill, of the bundle you've got there. This is a letter from the East of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service to you, 17th of November 1995. I'm writing to you about the blood transfusion you had as part of your treatment in Ninewells Hospital in 1988. We have now discovered that the blood may have been carrying an infection known as hepatitis C. This is caused by a virus, the hepatitis C virus, which could have been passed on to you by the transfusion. I very much hope that this has not in fact happened in your case, but I would like to recommend you have a blood test. This will show whether or not there is evidence of hepatitis C infection, and then there was a degree of further information and an invitation for you to attend an appointment. The first thing you did was to contact your GP. What can you tell us about what happened, and indeed what was your reaction to seeing that letter?
Well, Stan was self-employed at that time, so he collected all the mail. I'd come home from school, fallen asleep on the sofa, and he came up, as he always did, when it was time to collect the children, to say, because they had after-school activities, to say sometimes, to say who's collecting the children, by which he meant he was busy and was I up to it. And he said, oh, and there's this letter for you. I think you'd opened it.
I'd opened it because of the sort of the sort of less than urgent language about it. I'd kind of dismissed it as being one of these round robin type letters.
So
obviously I hadn't read it very carefully.
And I was so exhausted I didn't move from the sofa because I was angling for Stan to collect the children, and me not get up. So I said, what is it? And he said, oh, I don't know, it's one of your well woman things. I don't know quite what he meant by that, but I think and so I might easily not have taken it. I might easily have went, just a minute or something. So I took the letter, and I remember as I pulled it, I had one of those little windows in the envelope, and as I pulled it out, I saw East of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service, and my heart just stopped. And then I read the first paragraph, and I thought, I'm infected. I just knew immediately that, because whenever I saw East of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service, I thought it was a transfusion. And then I thought of the fact that I'd just woken up off the sofa. And I just remember having this feeling that it was almost like there'd been an enormous clang. My life will never be the same again. It was just an overwhelming feeling. And then very quickly, I said, no, this is bad. And Stan was going, it's nothing. And I said, no, it's about the transfusion. And I said, I'm infected. And he went, no, you're not infected. What is this? And he took it, and I watched his face change. I can recall the exact second that all of a sudden his face changed and he started to read it again. And I said to him, you might be infected. And he finished reading it very quickly, and he said, no, I'm not. And then he looked at me, and what he meant was, I'm not sleeping on the sofa. So he knew the vast difference between us. And as he said that, I said, the children might be infected, and then my world just fell apart. I can't tell you how. It's a good point to pay tribute to the people who've spoken to you who've lost their children, because I don't know how anybody copes with that. I was so scared my children were infected. I started screaming, and because it was 7 years, and I'd never seen my GP, though we had registered, and I was screaming at Stan, get the doctor, get us to the doctor, and he said the practice is closed, but I'll phone them. And I can remember screaming at him, you make them stay till we get there, and which the GP did. So we leapt in the car and raced to the practice. There was one car left in the car park, and banged on the door, and there was a receptionist with her coat on, and she told us which room to go to. And as we were going up the stairs, I said to Stan, she knows. She had her coat on, I just got the overwhelming feeling that this receptionist, who'd kindly waited 10 minutes, knew. And so we went in, and I met my GP, and he said, I was waiting for you to come because the blood transfusion service have been in touch with me.
And if we look at just one entry from your medical records, Jill, Paul, it's 363004. And Jill, you should have it, I hope, on the next page.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Could we highlight, please, Paul, towards the bottom of the page, the entry for the 28th of September, 1995, the first of those entries you've got there. So we've got T, telephone, phone call from Dr. Brooks, BTS Dundee, now found that the blood transfusion she received in 1988 was from a donor now found to be positive for Hep C. And then it says initially BTS will write to her, then I will contact her. So the blood transfusion service telephoned your GP on the 28th of September 1995. Your understanding is that your GP thought that it was information that should come to you from the blood transfusion service rather than from him. But in fact, it wasn't until nearly 2 months later that you received the letter.
Yes.
Telling you.
Yes.
And your primary concern is the 7 years in which you could have infected Stan or Lucy or Rory. But you do have an additional concern about that 2 month period when it was known to the transfusion service and your GP, but not to you.
I was surprised at the time, although it wasn't the priority at the time. My priority was, are my children safe? And I have a feeling that it is not fair to pick out the GP in particular, because I now know that the doctors who told me the blood was safe 7 years earlier must have known that that statement was not true. Even if they thought it was pretty much safe, they knew that there was a problem. And so Lucy was born in 1988, for example. It was on the front cover of newspapers in 1983 that there was a problem. So I didn't know that in 1988, but I know it now. So I feel very grateful that the Look Back survey found me. I wonder whether it might have been commissioned earlier. I think that is for you, Sir Brian, to discover. I mean, there may be a good reason why it wasn't, but it seems a long time to wait in order to try and find people. I know now, I think I'm right in saying that it was commissioned or it actually got underway in 1995, is my understanding. I saw an article in the British Medical Journal to that effect, which gave the impression, because of other dated articles, that it was getting underway either late 1994 or 1995. So I think that that is the bigger question. Why were my children at risk for 7 years? But in terms of those 2 months, the GP, in many ways, was very helpful. He may have thought they'd get in touch with me immediately. I think it's just one of those. I think any of us in that situation would wish that we'd got in touch straight away. That would be what I'd like to do.
The GP advised you to have the family tested. And
I asked, yes.
And arrangements were made for those tests. The tests for Stan and Rory and Lucy came back negative.
Yes.
Your test came back as requiring further testing.
Yes.
And you had a 2-week wait before you got the final result.
I think it was about 2 weeks, yes. We'd been told at the first test, if you were negative, you were clear, but if you had a positive test result, it may be a false positive, so they would then do a more expensive test. But obviously, it was not a surprise, and I think in those 2 weeks, or when we were waiting for the test result, I knew it was my last chance of a normal life that it came back negative. I didn't really think it would. Whereas poor Stan was desperate that it came back negative and absolutely collapsed when it didn't. It's not an unfair.
Yeah, probably that's the case, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Against all the evidence, really. It wasn't going to come back negative.
No.
What information or advice about hepatitis C or about treatment for hepatitis C was your GP able to give you?
Well, my recollection is that, of course, you couldn't, as another witness said, you couldn't Google. But because of teaching, I had a membership of the university library, so we told him that and said, can you give us some references? I remember him saying, I don't know anything about this. Do you recall that?
In fact, I remember that, and he also gave us, he had more access to computers than we did. He gave us one of these old-fashioned sheets of computer paper with a huge list of references.
Yeah, it had all the little lines on it.
Yes, there was no VDUs in these days. It all came out in papers, a whole list of references, and we set about these in the university library in St Andrews, looking through references and things.
And when we found them, we couldn't make head or tail of them.
Didn't make much of them, no.
Some very specific medical tests for specific lines of research that one would have to be...
They weren't, to use common parlance, user-friendly.
No, they weren't for the layman, no. But he was trying to help. Yeah.
But you found subsequently, looking in your medical records, an information sheet for GPs about interferon from May of 1995. Paul, we'll just have that up on screen, 363005. It's page 4 of the bundle you've got there, Jill. And we don't need to look at the detail of this, but we can see the date, May 1995, Centre for Liver and Digestive Disorders, Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. You have, as I understand it, no recollection of ever receiving this document or the information contained in it?
No, I have no recollection of seeing it. I first saw it when we requested my medical records for this inquiry. I'd previously been advised not to request my medical records. When we first discovered I was infected, I was advised by a St Andrews lawyer not to request my medical records because he said they'll be filleted by the time you've got them, which I must admit stunned me at the time. But it was around about the time we were deciding we couldn't afford to have a lawyer, so we just left it. So we requested them for this inquiry and at no cost, and found this information sheet. And I've I have had 2 courses of interferon. I've no recollection of seeing it before.
Stan, what can you recall about the advice that was given, may or may not have been by the GP, may have been by others, I'm not sure, about how to deal with risks of infection and what kind of hygiene steps to take?
Well, yes, obviously hepatitis is a bloodborne disease, and Jill's immediate concern was not to infect myself and the children and sort of, you know, people round about us. Now, the advice was it's hard to infect, you know, people you meet because it's bloodborne, but of course Jill, being a woman with a menstrual cycle and all that, she bleeds every month, and the nurses were, so that's the background, but the nurse was saying, oh yeah, keep things clean, bleach things, don't get blood near anyone, and being so keen to not to infect the children, Jill just did this to the letter. You know, she was.
We followed the advice to the letter.
Yeah. So,
but
to the extent you don't touch me, don't do this, don't. You know, I mean, you sort of. I can't remember the
bleaching the bathroom in the middle of the night sometimes.
Exactly, because I said to the nurse, well, when she said, if you do bleed, you must bleach the surface the blood is on, and I said, well, I bleed every month, and she said, so I said, what do I do then? What do I do about that? And she said, well, nobody's ever asked that question before, and she said, well, I said, we only have one bathroom now, and she said, well, I suppose if you have your menstrual cycle and you use the lavatory, you ought to bleach it before the children use it. So, of course, that was it. Every time I went to the lavatory, I would bleach it, and I would lie in bed at 2 a.m. thinking, have I got the energy, this was with hepatitis, to get up, go to the lavatory and bleach it, or will I just lie here and hope I get back to sleep? Because what I can't do is go to the lavatory and then I'll lie here awake trying to hear if the children are going before I get to it in the morning. So it became easier just to don't reinvent the wheel, if it just bleach everything. And then...
So just to interrupt you, I think the thing was the advice wasn't balanced.
Yeah.
There was no sense of proportion. The nurses were sort of reading from a strip, keep clean, bleach everything, and then when they delivered it to Jill, who was taking it quite literally...
Because I was scared for my children. Yeah.
There was no balance. It was a difficult
Yes.
thing for her to deal with.
I mean, yeah, if you'd said anything they told me to do to keep my children safe, I would have done it.
And Lucy, you recall a strict regime of hand washing being introduced, and if your mum cut herself, you'd be sent to your rooms, you and Rory, to be out of the way while she could clean and bleach everything.
Yeah, exactly, and sort of a main note, I'd say, of my and Rory's childhood was often just waiting for mum and dad to if mum had bled or cut herself, for them to clean it, or for household chores to be done that most people can achieve quickly, to be sort of pull themselves through them, and we'll come to that. Yeah.
I want to ask you about the treatment that you then embarked upon, Jill, the first course of treatment. So this was Interferon, May 1996, a 6-month course of Interferon. Now, you were warned of some side effects.
Yes.
But what were the side effects that you experienced?
Well, I was warned it would be like proper flu, and I was told that the symptoms of flu are actually caused by your body's defences, largely, and that interferon boosts your body's defences, so you would simply have flu symptoms to quite an extreme degree. And that seemed quite accurate to me. I was even more exhausted. At that point, I started walking with a stick. And on one occasion, more than one occasion, I think I had to sit down in the supermarket because I couldn't get round without... Anyway, I just take a little folding chair. And it was shivers, temperature, aching limbs, and basically just wanted to lie down. You just couldn't get your head down fast enough. I remember that if I moved my eyeballs in my head, it hurt like anything. So if somebody spoke spoke to me, I would, once I'd taken the interferon injection, I would turn my whole head so that I'd try and keep my eyeballs still. But at the same time, the bills keep coming in, and so I had to keep. We very quickly discovered that in that situation you have no flexibility. You've nothing. You've no resilience left to give. So generally, when people offer to help you in a small way, it's actually easier just to be left alone. And we very quickly worked out, if you rest, you pay for it. So you just have to have a routine and do your best to stick to it. Otherwise, it all unravels and you haven't got the energy to put it back together again. So that's exactly what Lucy was talking about, that once I started taking interferon, we got later, it took even longer to do everything. Stan was still trying to run an office to pay the bills. It was chaotic.
And Rory, you've described this period in your statement as the treatment and the effects of the treatment dominated your lives.
It absolutely did. The side effects that Mum's describing essentially left her asleep, bedridden every second day. You had an injection every second day. And so trying to meet all those challenges with half the available time, and the drugs used to come in batches of a few months. I can't quite remember, but I remember us sort of planning our lives around it. If we start the next batch of drugs today, then Mum will be awake for her birthday and Christmas. But if we start the batch tomorrow, then she'll be awake for sports day and a hogmanay, it completely dominated our lives down to sort of minute day-to-day details because of the requirements of trying to prevent anyone else getting infected, through to the bigger life decisions, because the loss of time, the loss of the ability to work, the fact that Dad was not only trying to run a business himself but acting as a carer for Mum, and without any recognition, really.
And you've said again of this period, and obviously through no fault of your mum's, that it didn't feel like you had a mum because she was so exhausted from the condition and from the treatment.
Absolutely, there was she had no option. She was asleep, every second day. So half our life for years at a time, we didn't have a mum.
Jill, this first course of treatment wasn't successful.
No.
How did you feel when you discovered that the course of treatment had not succeeded?
I trained myself that, because it's agony waiting for test results every fortnight, so I trained myself not to make that not a priority. So I think when they kept coming back positive, and then they were negative for about a fortnight, and then as soon as I stopped taking the treatment, I relapsed. So I just tried to hold on to this. We've got other goals in life. This is not my primary goal. I used to say my primary goal is not to get well, because I couldn't control that. I could try and achieve other things, like being a mum. But so when I relapsed, I think I was sort of mentally quite initially able to cope with that. But then we were told that because I'd relapsed, that precluded me from any other treatment, and we were not able to cope with that. That just destroyed us. Because by then I knew that hepatitis C starts to seriously affect your health, can start to seriously affect your health after 10 years, or maybe longer, but it can start to. And I had been told I was infected after 7 years, and this had all taken at least another year, more than that, I think. So at that point, I thought, I'm not going to see the children grow up because I'm not going to get any more treatment. And that then, we just began to plan for that.
one part of the plans was Rory had been offered an assisted place at a boarding school.
Yes.
And you decided to take that up because you felt you couldn't look after him and you weren't confident you would be around to look after him.
It was mostly the second part. Friends of ours asked us, friends of ours were taking this route for traditional family reasons. Because in Fyffe, everybody's friends with everybody because there's hardly any people there. So, and people were very kind. And so we because we had a lot of friends, and some of them were taking this route, and they said, why don't you, these schools have huge charitable foundations, why don't you talk to them? And what the reason that they said that was because they said, you guys are really suffering, you would be eligible for something like this. Not that we'd ever considered it. And when we heard that the treatment had failed, and that particularly that there wouldn't be any other treatment, I thought that, well, there was, I thought, for me, I wanted the children to stay with me, particularly if it was only for 2 years. And I thought I could, I could look after them, but as you've heard them say, it was not normal. It was all to suit me. But, so, they couldn't have friends around because Mum was asleep every second day and we didn't go camping anymore and we didn't climb hills and all. So it started to feel like this was the life that I'd wanted for them. Obviously, it was Rory to start with. This was the life that we'd always envisaged for them, and somebody else could give it to them. And that we were really lucky to have this chance. So, so we did apply, and this, I have to say at this point, the school was Fettes College here in Edinburgh. It was the biggest, it's such an act of charity on their part, because they did offer Rory a bursary, and and then they helped Lucy, and eventually, as you'll hear, they gave me a job. And on the day I left that job, when I became ill again, everybody who leaves the job has to make a speech, and in my speech I said, when nobody would help us, not the government, not the lawyers, not the doctors, you gave my children a life. And that is true, they did. But what it meant was that I remember I was in the shower, we were waiting to hear whether Rory would get a place, and I heard Stan shout, he's in, and I heard Rory cheer. And I remember just kneeling down in the shower and crying in the water, because, it was the result I wanted, but it's, and also I've just worried ever since, can he possibly understand? But I think what that shows actually is, on behalf of everybody that this has happened to, just how scary it is. It's really, really scary, and people are so brave. I think that doesn't always come across. I thought at that point I wouldn't recover. I was still frightened of infecting the children because I was still infected, and I knew that their lives were now so constrained, and I thought that would get worse. So Rory went off to boarding school, which ultimately has very many happy benefits. We're very grateful for them.
You did embark on a second course of treatment, having been told initially that it wouldn't be funded, and you did that through volunteering to participate in a research trial.
Yes, we got in touch with the hospital and said, you keep me right in this, but my recollection is that you got in touch with them and said, you can't just leave her like this, there must be something you could do. And they, at that...
We were...
Did we go together?
I'm not sure, but we were very unhappy because the reason for not treating Jill again was purely financial. Jill was sort of a good candidate. She wasn't one of the many chaotic people who get hepatitis who don't take the injections. Jill was taking the injections faithfully, trying her best to recover, and yet had relapsed. So for financial reasons, not because she wasn't a good candidate or anything, the doctors were saying, no, we don't want to spend the money on the treatment. And we were very upset about that, obviously, because this Jill had been given this infected blood product, then they didn't want to spend money to deal with it. So we were upset about that, but then, you know, they did sort of convince us, well, it's not going to work anyway, but we were, well, I can't remember if they convinced us or not, but then they came up with this possible drug trial, of course.
Yes.
We would have signed our lives away to try and...
And you did sign, or you were asked to sign an agreement not to bring any legal proceedings arising out of the drug because it was a research project.
Yes, as my understanding is that although both drugs, I think this is right, I think both drugs were licensed for other uses, but this was a trial of their combination to treat hepatitis C.
And it was interferon and ribavirin.
It was interferon and ribavirin. So it was the second course of interferon, this time for 12 months, while taking ribavirin at the same time.
And again, you found in your medical records a patient information sheet about that dual therapy, which you don't recall ever having seen before or being given.
I don't recall ever. I don't recall being shown it. Or no. I have to say that I probably didn't press very hard for information because as soon as they said there is a drugs trial, I just said yes, and they said you'll have to sign away. You'll have to sign whatever it is to say that in terms of this drugs trial, nobody's liable for anything, and I just said yes. We cheered. We were like, yes, we're getting a second chance.
Having said that document, I've never found that document that we seem to remember signing.
No, we don't have a copy of it. No.
What were the side effects like? Stan, can you recall how the second course of treatment affected Jill? Was it in a similar way to the first course?
I think the side effects were very similar. Yes, I think they were. I think they were exactly the same. I think perhaps even slightly worse because it went on longer. I certainly remember that once she had, once the treatment had been deemed a success, Jill she couldn't walk straight. She had a terribly sore back for such a long time that we didn't think you were ever going to be able to get straighten up.
Yeah, I remember that.
And she went to some kind of doctor who eventually fixed it. But for a lot, she was so, she was curled up. She was small. She was, she had a lot of hair, but she had lost a lot of hair. I mean, I could particularly remember the fact that
I was offered a wig at one point.
Yes.
I lost a lot of teeth.
The shower was always full of hair, and
I've hardly got any teeth.
Yeah.
It's a source of amusement how few teeth I have left.
This treatment did ultimately succeed in clearing the hepatitis C virus, although it was ultimately 2000 before you were finally given an all-clear message.
Yes, they keep testing in case you relapse again. Yes.
Now, during the years of that treatment and the testing period that followed, you've explained in your statement that you would underplay to doctors how ill you were and how much you were feeling the side effects of the treatment because you were desperate that the treatment would be taken away from you. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, yes. To start with, I tried to stay resilient just because that was my upbringing. So, when they said you've got hepatitis C, I tried to be brave, but very quickly I realised that everything was getting written down. And when I realised, and they spoke to me about, I also was treated alongside convicts and in shackles on one occasion, and you were sitting in the waiting room with people who brought their chaotic life. It was described as chaotic lifestyle, and they brought it with them into the waiting room, so it was quite an eye opener sometimes.
Just to add to that, one of the things that when they were testing Jill, were giving the interferon and the ribavirin to Jill, they were always testing some kind of limits, and I remember that Jill was always near the limits, and if she went over these limits, they'd have to stop it because it was too dangerous. So that was one of the reasons for Jill trying to, I'm feeling fine, I'm feeling great,
so
even though my platelets are low or whatever it was. We were trying to give a positive impression to counteract the bad limits you were getting.
Absolutely,
bad results.
because they told us that because of these people with chaotic lifestyles, they said it's, well, not because of them. They said sometimes we don't treat people because their lifestyles are too chaotic and they won't follow the treatment course properly. And for the first course, they said there's a success rate of about 25%, and I was shocked and said, I can't believe that's so awful. And the doctor I said that to was offended and said, well, actually, that's as good as some antibiotics. But I still didn't think it was very good as a, bolt from the blue. So we resolved we're going to do everything absolutely perfectly. And I sort of comforted myself that maybe that would get it up to 50%. So we actually bought a fridge. Well, we had a fridge where we put all our groceries, but we bought a fridge and put it in the bedroom so that we could put the medicine in it and people weren't going in and out all the time, affecting the temperature. So we said if we just max everything, then we'll push that chance up as high as it can go. So when I began to understand that there were ways to have the treatment taken away from you, and eventually we were told it had been, every time they said, how are you coping? I mean, it's no trouble at all. How are you feeling? Very well. Because then they had no reason to take the treatment away.
And those references
and that was
in your
fear.
medical records to feeling okay, feeling well, etc., you've said in your statement that when you were subsequently involved in legal proceedings, litigation against the Scottish Health Service, Secretary of State for Scotland, those references were used against you to suggest that actually things weren't as bad as you were saying.
That's right, yes. They came back at us in a letter saying that your patient, I'm not even paraphrasing because I don't have the letter in front of me, but basically saying we note that your patient is actually fine because, and quoting from doctors writing down patient reports that she feels very well. And at that time I had hepatitis and was being treated with interferon. I mean, I know that's my own fault in a sense, because I should have said I feel absolutely terrible, I can't cope, and I can't function. But it's just such a scary position to be in, especially, and I'll talk about this later, but especially because not once did any doctor, they were in the moment kind and helpful, but there was an absolute blanket silence about how I'd become infected. And there was no comment from any doctor or any nurse about, nobody ever said, this is, let alone saying this should never have happened. Nobody ever said what rotten luck, or it was, occasionally I would say things and there was just no reply, ever. So that's such a scary position to be in, because you're now entirely dependent on the people who will not comment on what's happened to you.
And you've discovered, again, from obtaining your medical records, that it appears you were enrolled in the National HCV Register. If we just have up on screen, please, Paul, 363025. And Jill, in the bundle you've got there, it should be pages 28 onwards. So we can see here there is a letter from the National HCV Register to a clinician, July 2006, and it refers to you, a patient who's enrolled in the HCV National Register, requests follow-up. And Paul, if we just go on a couple of pages, please, to the National Register documentation. Thank you. So we've got there a National Register of HCV infections with a known date of acquisition follow-up form, which is completed by a doctor. And then, Paul, if you would just go on again, just a few pages till we get to a patient information sheet, please. Next page. Next page. That's it. We can see here a patient information sheet which explains what the HCV National Register is. It says it collects information about patients, talks about patients being enrolled into the register. If you go down to the bottom of that page. I'm sorry, Jill, do you have it?
Yes, I do. Yes, thank you.
And it says what information would be included: medical information, spare blood samples, spare liver biopsy sections, and so on. Do you recall ever being asked for your consent or agreement to be enrolled in the National HCV Register?
I have no recollection of that. absolutely none. And I, obviously, some things I do find difficult to remember now, but I have absolutely no recollection of that. If they have a form that I have signed, obviously, then I have completely blanked it. But to the best of my belief, I have never seen that form. And I don't think you can recall.
I have no recollection, no.
It's worth pointing out, as part of trying to maximise the chances of any cure working, any documents were pored over at length and in great detail, and would, despite the memory problems,
Yes.
would still be in your mind.
Probably, yes.
Yes, I usually have a glimmer of it. I know I've forgotten something.
But as I understand it, Stan religiously keeps documentation, and neither of you recall any documentation relating to that.
Yes, Stan has been totally vindicated by this inquiry because he keeps everything. And now we're very glad of it.
I wanted to ask you about two consequences of the treatment. The first one I wanted to ask you about is something Lucy talks about in her statement, and that's the memory loss that you've observed, worse previously than now, better to some extent now, but memory loss in your mum. What can you tell us about that?
I remember starting to be really aware of mum's memory loss when she was being treated, so I was about 8, and that would be short-term memory loss. The thing I most remember about that was being in the supermarket and mum going to sign her name to pay, and her pausing, sort of looking away and vacant. And it was such a long pause that I realised that what she was struggling for was her own name. And so I offered her, I said, it's Jill. And she went, oh, thank you, and wrote it down. Which I can only imagine what the cashier was thinking. So that was the short-term memory loss when she was being treated. When I was a early teenager, I would refer to things from that time, from when I was about 8 to 10, things that Dad would have remembered, Rory would have remembered, common things to remember that day at the beach or something. And Mum would be blank on that, which I think was very hard for us both, because it was just hurtful. Neither of us was at fault, but it was just a shame. And I think those memories have actually, a lot of those memories have actually returned for Mum. But now the biggest gap in her memories is from before her treatment. So you can talk about that more than I would be able to.
Yes, when I can't even remember when this happened, but I think it was when I went back to work when we thought I was cured. Well, when I was cured of hepatitis, because the second course of interferon and ribavirin was successful. So as soon as I was cured, I wanted to get back to work because financially we were ruined. And so I went back to teaching, and again, it was before Kindle or anything like that, so everything was books on the shelf. And we actually, and I can't remember the reason why we did this, but we were going through all my books, and we were able to divide them into 2 piles, and there was this enormous pile of books which I knew I'd read, and I had not the singlest idea what any of them were about. And friends were laughing because they were saying it's like 3 books and you read them all again, and I literally didn't know what was going to happen. And it was all English classics, but it was really weird going, oh, I wonder what happens at the end of Wuthering Heights, you know. So that was, when I talk to my brothers and sisters, half the time I don't know what they're talking about because I can't remember. They remember. They obviously have normal memories, and a lot of I can't really, I remember about a tenth of what I remember. Also, the way my memory, I know this with trying to write, is that it's quite useful for writing, is that I have suddenly very vivid memories, so it's almost like being in the room, or particularly of different places, and that's great for describing a scene. But they're not under my control. So if somebody says, as Lucy is just saying, do you remember when we did this? I can't recall it when I want to, but then sometimes I'll suddenly have this really vivid memory, and I'll say, "Oh, I just remembered that," and they go, "Yeah." So it seems to be the way my memory works has changed.
The principal lasting consequence, though, of the treatment that you received for your hepatitis C has been an autoimmune disorder that you have developed, which causes extreme photosensitivity, sensitivity to light. Can you tell us about what exposure to light does to you?
I now know that if I face the sun or stand in direct sunlight, or if I sit under normal, what's regarded as normal interior lighting now, then my face will swell up, my face and neck will swell up because they're the bits that aren't covered. And eventually and the skin will thicken, and eventually little fissures will split and suppurate to the extent that it will glue my eyelids shut, and my ears sort of half come off. It's all suppurating down my neck. And if I do that, if I expose myself to normal light levels, just live like anyone else would live, day after day after day, it's cumulative, so it gets worse and worse and worse. And so that's eventually why I had to resign again, because I'll come back to that. To answer your question, I now know that that the skin is an organ, so that is the visible organ. But I now know that because I'm autoimmune, if I'm exposed to light, it affects other organs as well. I was told at the eye pavilion yesterday that it's also affecting my eye. And there's a whole long story of that treatment.
There's the condition that you finally, after a long time, as I understand it, been diagnosed with, is SLE, systemic lupus erythematosus. We talked about the pronunciation of this,
yes,
and I knew that I'd get
best
it wrong.
at it.
Erythematosus.
Thank you, Stan. And put in very basic terms, light causes your body to attack itself.
That's right, yes. Apparently, it's been explained to me that this happens, the figure I've been quoted is in about 1 in 100 people who are treated with interferon. So it's rare, but it's known, and we discovered it for ourselves by researching medical papers when we began to suspect it was a consequence. We thought we were researching to see if it was a consequence of hepatitis, and doctors were assuring us it wasn't. And then one day I said to Stan, I mean, when it happens, I feel awful. I said to Stan, I feel like I've got flu. It's like taking interferon again. And then he just looked at me and quickly Googled, this was quite recently, a link between interferon and photosensitivity, and found it in like a minute. And so sorry, can you remind me of your question, Jenny? Sorry.
I was asking you to describe the condition, and that's exactly what you're doing.
Oh, yes, they do. Yes, sorry. So we then discovered that it affects 1 in 100 people, and that's what I was going to say, and that you have more chance of developing autoimmune disease, having taken interferon, if you have what they call a predisposition, and that if you have an already slightly overactive immune system, then obviously it's easier to because all interferon does is boost your immune system really high to clear the virus. So, and if you have had eczema as a child or asthma as a child, those are caused by a slightly overactive immune system.
And you had childhood eczema?
And I had childhood eczema, yeah.
And in order to avoid these extreme consequences, the swelling, the lesions, the suppuration and so on, you've ultimately had to completely adapt your lifestyle. So for you to be sitting in the lights that you're sitting in here without wearing the hat that you originally wore is very unusual.
Yes.
The lights have in fact been adjusted to some extent.
Yeah, that one's been turned off, yes. And I came yesterday and your very kind technical team have reduced these lights by half, switched off the theatre lights that were here and switched that one off. So that I can see.
You essentially you and Stan together have reorganised your lifestyle so that you do much of what you would normally do in the daytime, in the daylight, at night, or
Yes.
when it's dark.
Yes.
And when you do go out in sunlight, you will be wearing the hat we saw earlier, and you have a cream that you have to put on
Yes.
religiously several times a day.
Yes. The cream is, I mean, it took a long time to get that diagnosed in hospital, and then I tried various treatments that the hospital suggested, and but the treatments, the first one wasn't effective, the second one made me ill, and so I said, can I not just avoid light? And the hospital agreed for a trial period that they would monitor avoiding light. So with the same rigour, they did use that word, with which I used to clean everything for the children. I now avoid light, although not rigorous enough to suit my children always. And the hospital monitored me and agreed that that was working. Basically, when I have a reaction, it will take me about 3 or 4 days to get over it. So there's a strong incentive. So it starts quite quickly, but it takes days to stop. There's a strong incentive not to let that happen. And it used to be that if you have autoimmune disease, the life expectancy is 10 years from date of diagnosis. That's not the case now because people can be treated, and I'm hoping it's not the case for me, because clearly if you just allow yourself to react all the time, you just effectively wear your body out. So I think if I don't react, I'm not living on borrowed time, I hope.
And you can't use a computer screen anymore because of the light from the computer, which is why the documents have been provided to you in paper form rather than coming up on a screen. You cannot watch television for the same reasons.
No.
And Rory, you...
Sorry, just to give us a sense of scale to this, obviously we're very thankful to the inquiry for the adjustments they made for us today, but today will be the trigger for 3 or 4 days of recovery that Mum has to do, when pretty much the majority of the day will be spent caring for your skin and trying to minimise reaction.
Yes, I think, we're not going to let me get ill, so they've turned all the lights down, but it will probably mean that I have to pretty much stay in the dark for about 3 or 4 days just to let it all recover. And that's basically what I do. Because it's cumulative, I try and build up resilience so if there's something I really want to go to, that I can manage with a hat, or people will adjust the lighting or something, then I just avoid light as much as possible beforehand, so that, because if my skin is already a bit shaky, then it will quickly degenerate. And that's how we live. So in order to stay healthy, I drag Stan out for walks when it gets dark, which at this time of year is about 1 a.m. And we literally walk about an hour a day for exercise when it's dark. Yeah.
It's also a very strange thing because Jill's condition, apart from having a slightly ropey-looking skin, isn't really manifest. And the precautions that Jill has to take are quite extreme, but if she takes them, she looks fine. So she's also going about with the stigma that, I'm behaving in a very strange way. Nobody believes I'm ill, but I believe it because I see sometimes if she sits at the table and she's too close to the light, you see her just turning red, or if she walks in the sunlight, her hands are suddenly so sore with Raynaud's disease that it takes her half an hour to thaw out. And sometimes she gets a thing called pericarditis, where the lining around her heart actually squeezes her heart. So if she just tried to live a normal life, all of these things would be attacking her, and she would probably die very soon. So she lives this very strange life, but she has no way of showing it to everybody because she...
so you have
she's got this sort of double whammy of...
Yeah, you have the feeling like you look crazy, and that is, I think, one of the great things about this inquiry, because that I would like to talk about at one point, is that when there is no official explanation for what's happened to us all, you look crazy. You look crazy to your friends, you look crazy to the head when you go and say, I have to resign now because of this thing that's not official. And it's, that, I think that's one of the worst aspects, asking people to cope with all this without any official backing, which, thanks to you, we now have.
And Rory, you've observed in your statement that avoiding light is an incredibly difficult thing to do in the 21st century. And it's a very isolating experience for your parents, particularly your mum. Absolutely.
The amount of light that mum can endure without a large amount of information is an incredibly small amount of light. The layman would call it, pitch black, and it just makes life incredibly difficult to function. And living in a room with blackout blinds or shutters, contributes to a feeling of cabin fever, of isolation, of loneliness, coupled with the lack of acknowledgement and understanding from the public and friends and family. It's an incredibly lonely and isolating position to be in.
And Stan, one of your observations in your witness statement has been that it's the lack of recognition of the causal connection between Jill's condition and the treatment for hepatitis C has been, at least until recently, a very frustrating thing for you to have to deal with. That doctor after doctor won't say there's a connection.
Yes, we were perhaps asking the wrong question for a long time, and the question was, is this connected with hepatitis? And the doctors, the doctors were saying, no, it's not connected with hepatitis, which was true, but it was a half-truth in that it's directly connected with hepatitis because it's the result of the treatment for hepatitis. So we felt there was definitely a conspiracy of silence about this. There was no acknowledgement that we were being treated Jill was being treated in London, where we were then living, by the top skin doctors, the top doctors who could deal with SLE, and no one there mentioned this causal effect.
I find that incredible because every time I go to the dentist or the doctor, I decided right at the beginning to tell people, we decided to tell people what had happened from the day we heard, because we wanted to tell the children, because otherwise we had to lie to the children, or we could tell the children and say, but you've not got to tell anyone, because that was having them lie to people. So we're in the fortunate position, I've utter sympathy for people who are not in our fortunate position, that we were able to tell. But it seems to me that if we could find out that causal link with no medical background whatsoever, it seemed incredible to me that doctors working at the top of their field were not telling. Did they not know? It's really difficult for me to believe that this is not common knowledge.
And you've exhibited to your statement and various papers that you and Stan have found through your own research. We'll just look at one example. It's 363021, please, Paul. It should in fact be page 21 in the bundle you've got there, Jill.
Thank you.
And we just need to look only at the first few lines of the article. It talks about a presentation in the Journal of Clinical Rheumatology, a case of severe SLE which developed during interferon alpha therapy for chronic hepatitis C. And then it talks about this case of life-threatening SLE adds to a growing body of literature about severe systemic autoimmune disease being induced in some individuals. And that's just one of the examples that you've provided to the inquiry.
Yes.
The one that clinched it for us was an article which we found and subsequently can't find, which said that children were being found to have SLE, and the only children that they ever found to have SLE in America, they were tested in America, were children who had interferon. So that just clinched it for us. I mean, that was proof positive. we seem to have lost the article there, but we were still questioning and wondering. But then the article said unequivocally, children with SLE have
been
interferon.
treated with interferon.
So it was,
usually for leukemia, I think.
And finally, and recently, that connection has, as I understand it from you, been accepted by SIBS
Yes.
for the purposes of a stage 2 payment.
Yes.
The interrelationship between your treatment for the hepatitis C and the autoimmune disorder has been acknowledged.
Yes, it has. And that was another astonishing day, because having been unable to do anything about any of this for years and thinking there's a massive battle in court ahead of us that we probably can't afford, all of a sudden a letter came through the post saying, if you have these symptoms, then we may be able to help you. I was like, oh, my goodness, after 30 years, suddenly it's accepted. So yes, it does seem to be, it's now much more in the medical literature than even when we discovered it 5 years ago.
The financial and employment and career prospects, Jill, consequences for you, Jill, have been fairly devastating. You've not been able to either pursue the career you would have wanted to pursue or, in fact, continue to work as a teacher.
Yes, after I was cured of hepatitis, I was very lucky because the children's school offered me a job, and because a teacher broke her leg, and then that teacher came back, but I was kept on, and so I resumed my teaching career just almost as soon as I recovered, and I was doing a lot of expeditions, which was sort of my thing, and teaching full timetable. But gradually I found I couldn't do the expeditions because I had this reaction after them. And then other members of staff started offering to cover my games lessons because they didn't like to see the state I got in after them. And then I upset a couple of heads of department by swapping classrooms every time the sun moved around and nobody knew where I was or the class was. But I got a lot of support from the school, particularly from the head and from lovely colleagues. But then what I really wanted to do was to teach the oldest pupils, which was my natural sort of thing. And a job came up within the school, so I applied for that. I'd been there for 5 years, and I applied for effectively teacher of English in the senior school and got the job. And that meant I didn't have to do all the exhibitions and everything, and I thought, well, that's good because I'm not really up to them now. But it meant I was spending hours on a computer, and very quickly it became apparent that I could only spend about 15 minutes on a computer without my face swelling up. And we went through a horrible few months where I just went about suppurating everywhere, and by then we were saying it's the light, because we tried everything else trying to work out what was happening to me.
It's a bit like what the gentleman said this morning, when he said you reach a level and you go down to a level, then you go down to another level, then you go down to another level. Joe was a housemaster in the prep school, which meant that we lived right in the school. I had a little office, I was self-employed, I had a little office in the school. And looking back on it, in between classes, Jill was nipping home and having a bath.
To calm it down.
To calm it all down.
And we thought that was sort of normal.
And the doctors were looking at, is it the eczema, is it your old-fashioned eczema reared up and all that sort of thing. We were at a loss, but because we were in a position which you'd cope with it, my office was being put off mildly by the fact that I was having to look after children while you were having a bath and things. But we were coping with it. But then moving to the senior school,
where you need hours in front of a computer because you're
not supported.
You're dealing with all their coursework and everything sent by email, and all the reports and all the marking, all the rest of it, and so I just got in a mess. I looked awful for about 3 months, and I went to get an appointment. I said to my GP at that time in Edinburgh was trying to figure out what was going on, and he said, well, I'll refer you to the hospital, but there's a 6-month waiting list. And I thought, we can't wait 6 months, so we paid for a private appointment. And it turned out it was the same consultant, so I effectively jumped the queue. I think it cost £200. And he said, he did some...
knew immediately what
he
it
knew
was.
immediately. He did some tests. I can't remember if it was blood tests or what it was. I think we had to go back. And when we went back, which was, I think, the same week, he said, I remember he said, do you have medical insurance? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'm referring you back to my NHS caseload because you can't afford this. You're in this for the long haul. And he said, now, I don't want you to go off on Google and get scared. And I said, well, you're too late because I've been Googling like mad. And he said, until we do further tests, I advise you to avoid the light conditions that are causing this, which was just normal. And so I said, well, I'd have to resign to avoid light conditions that are causing this. And I just remember he just looked at me over the desk, and I was just stunned because I just, after the whole hepatitis thing, fought my way back up to where I would have been. And so I remember I said to him, well, can you put it in writing? Because all I was thinking was the head will think I have gone mad. And so I have the letter saying, avoid those light conditions till we find out what's happening. So then I just went to the head and said, I have to resign. And he said, but it's all going so well. And I went, no, it's not really. Everyone's covering for me and I can't use a computer. And he was sort of reluctant. And he said, well, Jill, you know we'll help you. And I said, do you know who's typing my reports? Because it was the end of term. And he said, no. And I said, your personal secretary. And he said, yeah, we can't find. So that was me resigned. But then that was a major disaster for the family because that was our income halved again. Yeah.
And you've not been able to go back to work,
No.
Because of the SLE.
Yeah.
Stan, what's the impact been on your work and your business over the years?
Well, it has varied over the years, but basically it has changed the entire nature. The nature of the business has been just to survive.
Yeah.
It's been a hand-to-mouth existence, and still is, in fact. Once we were, when Jill had her job, we were just recovering. We had loads and loads of debts from everything. We were just recovering, just got our debts paid back. We just bought a house, and we're just away to sort of say, okay, let's get going now. When Jill had to resign again, and the children were just at the stage of going to university. In fact, Rory was at university in London, and Lucy was heading down to university in Oxford. In fact, she was in London for a course at that time as well. And we could no longer fund their flats or their accommodation and our house as well. And Jill, by this time, was determined not to take on debt, not to take university loans because we'd been in debt. We just got out of it. It had been horrible.
Well, I'd like to explain that point, if I can.
Well, if I finish that point, yeah. And so basically, we then moved down to London. I was fortunate. I got a good job in London. Through circumstances, when the crash occurred, I was judged with a very, very large project, government project. When the crash occurred, the project was axed, so I was left. I was made redundant, so I started up again, self-employed in London, and it's been hand to mouth ever since. With myself, Jill, at some stage Rory, Lucy, Frankie, Zoe, all living in the same flat, 2-bedroom flat. Me working in the kitchen, or sleeping in the kitchen.
But that doesn't make sense unless we explain that when we knew there wouldn't be any help, and I heard this yesterday or today, I think, and this happened to us, that we thought, when this happened, we thought this will take 20 years to sort. It's actually taken 30 years to sort. So we've got to plan a life. We can't just put everything on hold for 20 years. So our big thing was, we want to soak it up, not pass it on to the children. And in a very strange way, that made me feel they can't have student loans, because if I'd had a salary, I could have paid for all of this. And so we just tried to find another way of paying for it. So that was the sort. I don't know whether these are a good thing or a bad thing. It's like saying, I will buy a fridge and put it in my bedroom, just put the medicine in it. I don't know whether that is actually helps you get through. I don't think it makes any difference to the result, because the people who died were really, really brave, probably braver than me, and they still died. So it's nothing to do with the result. It's just to do with how you get through. And I don't know sometimes whether these things help you to get through or actually, because they're not reasonable, all of them, but then you're not in a reasonable situation. So anyway, that was we felt that we could have lived in, we could have just said to the children, well, look, you're going to have to do that everything. It's not your dad's fault. It's not my fault. But we wanted to try and make it that life would be the same for them if this hadn't happened, which led to some strange things like all living in 2 bedrooms. Instead of, I remember Rory was in a because I had a salary, Rory was in a flat with the lads down at Imperial, and when we phoned up and said, we've had this great idea, we'll move to London and you come and live with us. And there was this long silence, and then to pay for your sister. And there was this long silence, then he said, yes, that is a good idea. It's also the end of my social life, which it pretty much was. But that was how we coped with it. And Lucy, I ought to say in that regard, we got through, so we paid for her accommodation in Oxford, and we got through to her final year, and there was just absolutely no money left. And so Lucy went to the proctor at the university and said, can I commute from London, where we had this little flat? And they said yes. So every morning she got on the bus for 2.5 hours, went to her classes, and then got on the bus for 2.5 hours and came back to London for a year, which was, I remember she put porridge in her pocket. That's what I remember most, making porridge and then you put it in your pocket.
I wanted to ask Lucy, first of all, a little about the impact of all of this. And firstly, your observations about the impact of everything that your parents have been describing on your dad.
I think that, who these infections have happened to, they've just happened to a random bunch of people, and not everybody's born equipped for facing these challenges. Mum is made of steel, Dad is a mere mortal, and it's sometimes been hard for him to deal with that emotionally, and has triggered him being in bad moods, and then everybody has to rally around and bring him back to his courage. But I have to say that almost all of the time, Dad has shown extraordinary courage in response to this situation, and he has stepped up and just joined Mum in dealing with what has happened to her, to the extent that Dad lives in the dark too. He was saying earlier that the lights are giving him a headache because he just wasn't used to it. And that's meant that Dad has, especially supporting Mum financially, and he's said a little bit about the difficulties there. Both my parents get, I'd say on average, 4 to 5 hours sleep a night, and that's not necessarily in one block, just trying to deal with this. So obviously Mum had fatigue as part of her of the symptoms of hepatitis C, and now gets this kind of flu-like thing in response to a light situation. But Dad falls asleep all the time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't, I'm kind of quite proud of him staying awake right now. In quite distressing situations, he can be standing talking and fall asleep. He can be at something he's been looking forward to and fall asleep. He can fall asleep halfway through a mouthful because his body is just under such pressure. He puts himself under that pressure to step up to the mark. I'm personally extremely concerned obviously for how long Mum might live, because we don't know at this stage. But I'm also concerned about how long Dad might live as a consequence of pushing his body for so long, so hard. Yeah.
I'd just like to say that Lucy is absolutely right, that I know in the situation that we were in, particularly when we were young, as soon as I knew that I was infected, I was determined that Stan wouldn't be infected either, although obviously your terror is for your children, isn't it? But I was determined that Stan wouldn't be infected. And you can imagine what that meant for us. And he has never, ever... he's just always been right there. And even though...
Not always behaving as well as he should.
Yes, but always there. And that's amazing, I think.
Lucy, can I ask you about the impacts on you? You've gone into some detail in your statement, and I can read any part of your statement if you don't want to talk about it. But you've put it this way in your statement, that because your mum was transfused immediately after your birth, you've never had a life pre-contamination. What's that meant for you?
A few things. The story started with me this afternoon. It started with me any time Mum's explained how she came to be transfused, or any of us have. It starts with me in Mum's book, Lifeblood. We found out about Mum's infection when I was 7 years old. So as a 7-year-old, I was told Mum has this disease, and Mum and Dad were always very upfront with us. So they were very brave and told us exactly what was going on and tried to look brave so we wouldn't be scared by them being scared. So what I was told was Mum's ill, and she became ill after your birth. So what I heard, being 7 years old, 1 second, was Mum is ill because of you. The trouble is that's so clearly not true that if I applied my rational brain to that, it doesn't even get a second. It doesn't even. Thank you, Rory. It doesn't even need questioning of stupid. But that thought has lived in me and grown in me. And everybody's heard the kind of the length of this story and the different parts of it, and the financial difficulties and Mum's ongoing health concerns. Every day growing up, and exacerbated by the unusual conditions of mine and Rory's upbringing compared to the other children we knew, I would live with this deep, dark feeling, but I didn't know what it was. And it wasn't actually until about 2 years ago, when everybody else was living up in Scotland, and my husband and I were living down in London, and we'd been to visit everybody, and I was feeling quite homesick when we went back down. I thought it was homesickness. And I was feeling very, very bad those 2 days. So on the bus home from work, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
You are.
Good. On the bus home from work, I called Mum to say, Mum, I just feel awful. I had put into place things where I'd said, if I think this very bad way, I'm just going to take 20 breaths. I'm just going to count to 20, carry on. But at the end of the second day, I just had counted to 20 so many damn times. It was very, very frustrating. So I called Mum and asked and said, I need to speak, and because I feel awful. And she said, can we call back later, because Rory and Zoe are just popping round, and then they're going to the cinema. And and we'll be able to talk about it then. But in the meantime, I became so distressed, and this never happened to me before, that I was trying to heat up some soup, and I couldn't even get the packet open. I just couldn't stay still long enough to get the packet open, and I ended up wailing in quite a lot. I was alone, so quite alarming to me. I was just sort of, it was like a disgusting sound coming out of me, and I didn't know what was going on, so I was a bit scared. So I called my husband, who was meant to be going to the theatre, and said, please, can you actually just come home, because I feel very unsafe and Mum's not available yet. And I called Mum, and she was upset because Rory and Zoe hadn't managed to go to the cinema because everybody was discussing the financial situation of Mum and Dad going forward, and this was before their little bit of support that they're now receiving. So I said, no, you guys sort that out, you call me back. But I was very distressed, and I was very upset that they were upset, and I was very upset that I was so upset and I couldn't speak to them. And then this was whirling around my mind as my husband was making the soup, and I was just thinking, and all of this, everybody's upset, and it's all because of me. And then it just hit me like you know, a eureka moment, and I actually became quite elated because suddenly this sort of thing that had sat and grown, it had just through the chance of the different things that had been going on that day, had managed to get out and get an expression, and then I could see it and see how wrong it was, but how real it had been. So I don't know what your question was, so go again.
You're absolutely answering it. I was asking you about the impact upon you.
Yes.
And your sense of there never having been for you a life pre-contamination and how that had made you feel.
Yeah.
And you've realised, as I understand it from your statement and from what you've just said, that you've been living with feelings of guilt.
Yes.
Irrational
Exactly.
feelings of guilt, but feelings nonetheless
Yes.
for many years.
Yes. And those coupled with the unusual circumstances of us growing up came together and triggered, when I was about 9 years old, although I didn't know that this was what it was at the time, a chronic case of social anxiety, which I only really started to be able to talk about 5 years ago, but I'd never heard of it before, so I was just describing my symptoms and we weren't really getting anywhere. And then when I had that eureka moment, I stopped looking for what was wrong with me because I thought I'd worked it out, and I felt better for a few months, but then the anxiety started to come back, so I started searching again. And then I just happened on a book about managing social anxiety, and I thought, well, this isn't me, but maybe it might elucidate something. And I'd done that many Google searches trying to work out, why do I feel so awful all the time? Particularly because I'm a very extroverted person, so it becomes a bit of a vicious cycle of I want to be with people because that gives me energy, makes me happy. And when I get to be with people, I become very anxious, so I want to be alone. And then I feel very drained, so I want to be with people. So I go around in a bit of a loop. So yeah, I found this book by chance, and it was exactly described my situation. And I have to say that just the public inquiry happening and being asked to give a witness statement, I decided to put all this down, and then the inquiry team suggested that I contact the British Red Cross, which I was a bit unsure about, but I did. And then they suggested I speak to my GP, which again I was unsure about. You may not wonder why, but I did speak to my GP because she's a very nice lady, and she referred me for a mental health assessment, and I'm just about to start CBT. So all of the inquiry happening has really helped me, put words to this and receive the right treatment, and it has been, I mean, I'm just in a different place from a year ago with all of that. I probably should say on this point that most people who know me know nothing about this. I guess that's one of the things of social anxiety, is the last thing you want to, because you feel that people can see that there's something wrong with you, so you think. I suppose for me it was maybe this guilt thing that I didn't want anyone to see. The last thing you want to seem is not totally fine. So I have spoken to some very good friends about it recently, but you know, that's 20 years after it started, and our many friendships have been that long and they've not known a thing.
And one of the observations you've made in your statement, and I think indeed in one form or another all of you have made it in your witness statements, is the effect of what you've described as the silence of officialdom.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little more about that?
Well, there's two sides to that, I think. The first one is that as a 7-year-old, taking that on my own shoulders, mum's illness and everything that followed, I think if somebody else had taken responsibility, it might have been clearer to me that it wasn't my fault. Then, I forgot my two things, but something else I would say is when the public hearings in London started, I had this feeling of, well, I can't have caused all of these stories. So that was relieving to me. It'll come back to me, my other point.
One of the points, and it may or may not be the one that you're thinking of, Lucy, but one of the points you make in your statement is there's been an inability for you to talk about this because other people know nothing about it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because it's not been officially acknowledged, it's very difficult to bring up because you sound slightly, as Mum's saying, kind of crazy, like nobody knows what you're talking about, which is very isolating. And I think that was why the beginning of the London hearings was a bit of a watershed for me, because then I could refer to it. I could seek, other people to know about what was going on for me, which I couldn't do before, because I felt that if they hadn't heard of it, I could say, "Have you not been reading the news?" Whereas before, it just, what do you refer to? It's not happened. Yeah.
Rory, can I ask you, you've again described in your statement very vividly the impact of again, everything that we've been hearing about on your upbringing and indeed on your young adulthood. And you put it this way, that every decision that's ever been taken in your collective family lives has in some way or another been affected or driven by the fact of your mum's illness and the consequences of that illness. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. I've been, throughout my life, utterly blown away, astounded by the fact that in this situation of adversity, Mum and Dad's driving force has been to not let this infected blood impinge on the next generation. And that's an impossible task. That is not possible. And it's influenced every decision they've made, the bigger life decisions. We've spoken about the smaller, mundane daily decisions which are also affected. I've for every decision I make now is in some way trying to live up to the standards that they set for themselves and trying to pay back the opportunities they've given me and my sister. And that night, talking about the finances and planning that Lucy referred to a moment ago, as an example, we make these plans about the future and finances and life and jobs and family, and we make all these plans, but they don't work. There's not an answer. There's not enough money. There's not enough time. There's not enough support. So I know that really upsets my parents that my wife and I are trying to start a family and plan our lives. But we are, we are also planning how to support my parents in their retirement, which I know they find incredibly difficult to hear, but it's just the reality of the situation we're in. So every decision you make is affected by the infected blood.
And you feel a sense of responsibility to look after your parents.
Absolutely.
But a lack of confidence in your ability to do so.
Yeah, as I say, it's a problem without a solution, and the only solution that I can offer is to raise the standards a bit higher, or to try a bit harder, to put more effort, to just keep battling away and just try and make it work, and so that the consequence of that is that one never succeeds, one never achieves anything. And I really struggle with confidence, because, well, that's the outcome of it.
Can I speak now? Yeah. Obviously, my children, I think Rory is right. You cannot cope with something like this. And obviously, that's really upsetting for Stan and I, because that Rory has achieved so much. If I told you his CV, it is astonishing. You know, he's put on concerts in Buckingham Palace. He did the Queen's Jubilee. It's astonishing. But he feels that it's not good enough. And any time we say to him, oh, that was really well done, it hurts him to hear it, because it just, presumably, I'm assuming, this feeling wells up of, but it's not good enough. And that's because, and I think that, and what Lucy says is absolutely right as well, that Lucy has suffered on her own for 20 years and none of us knew. And all our efforts to say, right, we're going to soak this up and it's not going to hurt the children, have totally failed, because you cannot cope with something like this. And so I think what Rory and Lucy say is absolutely true, that had there been an official recognition, we would have had more normal lives, because we wouldn't have had to set high standards. We could have said, oh yeah, we're those people, and then the bar would have come down. But nobody said that. It was just match your friends with both hands tied behind your back, and you can't do it. It doesn't work. So both Lucy and Rory have been and Zoe and Frankie have been absolutely amazing in continuing the collegiate way we make decisions and the way we support each other, which I think was sort of the way we naturally inclined. But when the letter came, we told them straight away, now we're going to decide everything together. If you've got to be tested, here's a chance to do all those things in the school that you can't do anymore, and what do you want to do? So we made all those decisions together. And I remember when we first met Zoe and Frankie, we were having one of our family discussions trying to decide, which is always about how we can cope on not enough money. And I always remember, so they tend to go on and on and on because there isn't actually a solution. And I always remember, I hope you don't mind my saying, but Zoe getting out of bed saying, oh, what's happening? I better join in. And I've never forgotten it. I felt so supported. And now the boot's on the other foot. The next, Lucy and Rory and Zoe and Frankie certainly supplying all the emotional support that I hope we used to supply to them. And as Rory says, we make plans because we now have a little support as of last December. We were able having sold our house twice to cope with the situation over the years, we were able to buy a little house very far away to keep it cheap. And the plan is that Stan will work till he's 75. And that will, by then, we'll have I mean, it was amazing. We found a bank at Christmas that would give us a mortgage, and Stan is 63. And he'll have paid for the house by the time he's 75. And that is, and then he can stop. And that is, we're able to do that. We were going to do it anyway, but as Rory said, the plan did not work. It just didn't. It depended on me writing a bestseller. Well, it's like not going to. But now we think we might just squeeze through if we basically do nothing but work. Stan just works every day of the week and every evening. He actually said when we were driving down to Edinburgh last night, he went, "We've got a day off tomorrow." I'm not sure he meant to look at it like that, but what he meant was I'm not stuck in the office as I have been month in, month out.
Switch my phone off, yeah.
Yeah, he meant I'll switch the office phone off, yes.
Jill, it may not be a bestseller yet, but you've written your family's story in this book, Lifeblood. And what was it that drove you to write this?
Really resigning, because that drove me to write any book, because I've always written on and off. My aim was with in creative writing with Douglas Dunn, who is he won the Queen's Medal for Poetry about 3 years ago. He was my supervisor, and so it's always been, one never writes for money, because you would literally be better off buying a lottery ticket, but it's always been something I wanted to do. And then when I resigned, it was something I could still do, because we found, initially the family helped me, but because I couldn't use a computer, but you can write in a dark room. In fact, it's amazing. You can't read in a dark room, but you can write in a dark room, and when somebody puts the lights on, they can read it. And then we found, initially the family helped by typing it, and then I found a student who was sufficiently adept on a computer that she would type it up fast enough that we could afford to pay her. So we paid her by the hour, but she could do what I could write in a day, she could type in about 3/4 of an hour. So we could afford her, and she was scrupulously honest. And that's how I wrote Lifeblood, in the dark, with Amy typing it up. Well, with the family to start with, and then Amy typing it up. And so I've forgotten your question now. Sorry, could you remind me?
No, you can't. I was asking you what prompted you to write it.
Oh, prompted me to write it. So before I started writing Lifeblood, I'd resigned, but I could still write. And so, as Rory said, we've got a plan. It's a really sketchy plan, but the plan is that Dad will keep going and Mum will write a book, and if that works, Dad can stop. And I'd written a novel, which actually got, I got an agent quite quickly, but to my family's despair, I can't do scary stuff. I've had enough scary stuff. So I'm not one of the most commercial of writers. But anyway, the agent, I was despairing to the agent one day, and she said, and I actually heard myself say, "You see, the thing is, because of this blood transfusion, I haven't got anything to write about," meaning my life has been so constrained. And she said, what blood transfusion? And when I told her, she went, "Well, why don't you write about that?" So I went home and said, "Oh, Jenny wants me to write about all that's happened, but I don't really want to, I don't want to, write about that." And immediately, all the, I don't like to call you the young people, but said, "Mum, you have to write that, you have to write that." And
for all the people that can, for all the people that aren't here to write it.
Yes, exactly. So I started writing it, and I wrote our story, and that got a publisher. So just the family story got a publisher, but the publisher said, "You have to put that in a wider context, so you'll have to rewrite the second half with putting it in the context of what's happening. And it was really difficult to work out how to do that. I rewrote the second half 4 times, and eventually I just thought, well, the only way to do it is as I discovered it. So that involved just telling the story of, because when he said you'll have to put it in a wider context, I went off to the British Library, and I had some references to newspapers, so I thought I'll start with that. So I went to the British Library, and it's not there now. It's all computerised in Euston Road, so I can't access it. But I caught the last 6 months of everything still being on microfiche in Colindale, which meant a very long tube journey. But as Rory will explain, tubes are dark. Rory understands that our eyes adapt to light. He's explained to me. Our eyes adapt to light, so it's actually very dark in this room compared to being on the ground floor. But your eyes adapt, so it doesn't seem that different. The scale is, the eye is amazing. So on a sunny day, it's about 20,000 lux. And on a grey winter's day, it's about 40 lux. And yet your eye just adapts, and you think, well, I can see it's daytime, which is why I'm much more able to go out in the winter than in the summer. So on the tube, I was saying, oh, there's loads of lights, and Rory went, Mum, the tube is dark, you can travel on the tube, and it transpired that was true. So I could go to the library, and everything was on microfiche, which is very dim. In fact, you can't read all of it, it's so dim. And so I was able to do the research for the book, and then I thought, I tried photocopying the newspaper articles and peppering the book with them. That was the result I wanted, because it was really quick. But the publisher said, no, that's not a story. So I thought, well, the only thing to do then is just tell the story of finding out. And in fact, that worked very well, because I didn't know that, I had no idea of the scale of this contaminated blood disaster until I did that research. I didn't even know. I didn't know the numbers. I didn't realise it had been in the press long before I had my transfusion. I was coming home every day saying, listen to this, look what I found. And it was very haphazard research, because I'm not actually physically capable of doing proper research now. But it was very suited to me, and produced a sort of timeline of events which allowed me to finish the book.
That concludes my questions for you, but I wanted to ask each of you if you had anything to add, and starting with Lucy.
I just wanted to read the following. The truth of what has happened will be littered with missed opportunities for thousands of doctors and civil servants to take responsibility to ameliorate the situation in thousands of different ways. I had a similar opportunity today. I could share the impact Mum's blood transfusion has had on me, to add to the complete story to help the public inquiry team. This was hard to do, not least because of the stigma surrounding mental health issues in our society. But I have taken responsibility and done it. So I have 2 questions. How different would the total story have been if every opportunity afforded to all doctors and civil servants to ameliorate the situation had been taken? And where are their voices now, clamouring to admit their own faults and apologise? I would like to single out the Scottish Health Board, who, speaking at the opening of these hearings, failed to apologise. So, in summary, and possibly out with the public inquiry, just human to human, I would like to ask all doctors and civil servants who have in any way been connected to the infected blood disaster to consider, could I have done more? Thank you.
Rory, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, thank you. So I'll just read this out. Growing up as a member of our family, the culture of silence from the NHS left us feeling truly alone, and that we somehow were supposed to shoulder the guilt and hardship of our situation and to take responsibility for rectifying it, an impossible task. The only outside support we received was huge generosity and care from a handful of educational institutions. Once we received the letter, we became aware of the figures surrounding the numbers of infected people, but this was not examples of shared experience and was of little comfort. I'd like to thank the inquiry for bringing this disaster out of the silence and acknowledging publicly what has happened and for focusing on people's stories. However, every article I read always quotes the same figures that were so meaningless to me for all those years. Let me try to give you a more meaningful sense of scale. The estimated number of people who have died as a consequence of infected blood is akin to the number of British soldiers killed during the evacuation of Dunkirk and is akin to the number of people killed when the Twin Towers came down. To appreciate the scale of the number of people infected and affected, one must deal with disasters such as Chernobyl. I give these examples not to shock or sensationalise, the evidence is shocking enough, but to help those in a position to make a change, to quantify the levels of ongoing suffering. I want to take this opportunity to plead with the State, Department of Health, the NHS, hospital staff, GPs, and the inquiry to show the same level of support and care that those educational institutions showed our family, and to implement the medical, emotional, mental health and financial care that has been missing for all these decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Stan.
This is a day that I thought I would never see, and this inquiry is more than we ever thought possible, so thank you. There's only one course of action when you make a mistake. You should admit it, you should face up to it, you should rectify it, and you should do it immediately. With respect to infected blood, Britain, not just the NHS, Britain did not do this. And as a result of this, thousands of lives have been irrevocably altered and in some cases destroyed. This inquiry and Sir Brian are Britain's best hope that this lesson will be learned.
Thank you. And Jill.
I'd like to start by paying tribute to the families for whom my worst nightmare is true, the people who have lost their children. I cannot think where their courage comes from, and I admire them so much for helping the inquiry. And I wanted to lead on from that and talk about the absolute terror that one feels in this situation. And as you know, as you've heard today, I was terrified I'd infect my children. In fact, I nearly killed them when I crashed the car. I was too ashamed to go to help when I burned my daughter. None of that, all of it was either made worse or caused by the official silence that my children and husband are talking about. And that is unforgivable. One, I don't know how the mistakes came about that brought about this disaster. That's for you to decide, Sir Brian. And it may be that there are certain circumstances or excuses that I don't know about. But I can't see any reason for the silence that we have lived with. I can't see any reason that we have lived alone as a family until now. And when people ask me if I'm angry, that's what I'm angry about, that we were put in danger when we didn't know to take precautions, when I didn't know not to drive the car. And we lived in fear that we weren't coping and our children would be taken away because we didn't know why we weren't coping. All of that was made worse or brought about by a lack of responsibility at high level by the government or by the NHS. I'd like to thank my family because they took that responsibility for all the nice things they say about me, they took it. And they never let it go when everybody else, government after government, said in my research that it was too big a responsibility for a government to take on. Well, since my son was 3 and my daughter was a baby, they've taken it. And my husband, despite the distress it has caused him, has never let it go. And I want to thank you, everyone involved with this inquiry, for relieving them of that, because I have seen the happiness that they have felt when this inquiry was launched, and that happiness has grown as the inquiry proceeded. And I feel now that I haven't managed to cope with this, but that you have brought them the relief that you have brought them, and we hope for the future the relief that I so much wanted to bring them, but I just couldn't. Thank you.
Jill, I'm just going to ask Mr. O'Neill if there's anything further.
Thank you.
There are no further questions. Thank you, sir.
Well, can I make 3 observations? The first is that I've read a lot of statements. I have by no means read them all, but I will. And a lot of those statements are from those who suffered from hepatitis and who almost to a man or woman had interferon treatment to cope with it. There are, I kept no particular count, but there are 3 or 4 certainly who have described light sensitivity as a consequence. And I thought you ought to know
Thank you.
Of that. And if it should be the case that it is substantiated, as it may well be, that interferon treatment may in some cases give rise to light sensitivity, I certainly would regard it, and I would be difficult, I think, to shift from this point of view, that it is a consequence of having been infected with hepatitis C, and if that hepatitis C was a consequence of infected blood, it was a consequence of that.
Thank you.
That's the first.
Thank you.
The second is that you've each, in your own way, made a powerful plea for those who might have said sorry at an earlier stage to have done so. It is right, I think, that I mention again to you and in fact to those who are listening that I heard Eleanor Gray, QC, for the Department of Health, say that wrong had been done when she addressed me in September last year. And that, I think, just needs to be said as a matter of record, although it already is. But thirdly, can I say that you, Lucy, described you, Jill, as a woman of steel. You described the whole experience of having hepatitis as scary. I suspect it may have been quite scary, despite your welcoming the inquiry and wanting to be here, to decide to come here as a family and lay bare what are your own different perspectives on what has taken place. And that seems to me to take a huge amount of courage. It has affected you all. I suspect it probably has affected us all. Can I just say thank you? We can't achieve what we would like to do in this inquiry and get a proper perspective of as much as we can without the evidence of people like yourselves who are prepared to take the scary step that you have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes the evidence for today. Excuse me for talking while you're going back to your seats. To Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. And what do we have in store tomorrow?
We have 3 witnesses tomorrow, sir. Pamela Pennycook, Alice Mackey, and then our 3rd witness is anonymous.
Thank you. 10 o'clock.